Welcome to part 4 in my series on coding the game of Ultimate Texas Hold'em in C++. You may recall in part 3 we cycled through all the ways the cards could play out with the dealer hand, so now we're going to take it back in time one level to looking at all the way the player's turn and river cards can come out. In other words, the ways things could happen that would influence the player's decision whether or not to make the medium raise. So much like in the part 3 video, I'm going to actually start in Excel, and I've done some work in advance to categorize all the ways things could happen. So this first table shows what could happen if the player checks the medium raise. So then he's going to go on to the opportunity for a small raise, and this shows all the different hands the player could get at the end. Column C is whether or not the dealer qualifies. DQ means he did qualify. DNQ means he did not. Column D is how much the player won or lost on the raise, and note it's 0 if the dealer does not qualify because that's an automatic push. Column E is how much the player wins on the raise, and notice it's always 1 or -1 according to which side had the higher hand. I should put in a 0 here for a tie, and as well as here and here. Column F is how much the player will win or lose on the blind bet, and column G adds columns D, E, and F to get the total win. And then down here I concatenate all these total wins, and I'm going to copy and paste that over into my compiler later. And down here, this table here shows the same thing, but the player raising the medium raise. So that's why the player is either winning or losing 2 on the raise if he makes that medium raise. And I also want to point out that folding is a possibility if the player checks the medium raise, because then those 2 cards will be dealt and the player will have a chance to fold after that, which he does not if he makes the medium raise. So later I'm going to again copy and paste these arrays of wins or losses into C++. So we are now back in Visual Studio, and let's create a function to evaluate what could happen on the turn. So what we're going to need to know is the player's first 3 cards, the first 2 cards, his whole cards, and we're going to need, and at this point we're going to know the cards on the flop, and we're going to call those C1, C2, and C3, the C standing for community, because it's a community card. And thinking ahead here, I am going to make arrays for all the things that could happen if the player checks and if the player raises at this point after the flop. So let's call these arrays the check event and the raise event. So before I forget, let's copy and paste those arrays from Excel. Copy and paste, and go back, copy and paste. So these are very important arrays. This is how much the player is going to win or lose according to what he does after the flop. So next, let's, you know what I'm going to do just to kind of keep things simple is I mentioned before how if the player checks, there's a possibility that he later folds. So we need one other possible event for checking. But just to make the arrays the same size, I'm just going to throw in a dummy 0 at the end of the raise array. So let's initialize those. Let me make sure how many elements there are. So there are 24 possible outcomes. So next let's cycle through C4 and C5, which are the 4th and 5th community cards, otherwise known as the turn and the river. So let's start with the turn, C4. So that can go from 0 up to 50. And now let's check if it's in the deck. We go on. So C5 will start where C4 left off, and that can go as high as 51. And let's check that C5 is in the deck. And before I forget, so let's say C4 is still in the deck. Now let's take it out of the deck. Right after we've checked, whoops, one equal sign. And then let's put it back in the deck after we've cycled through C5. And let's do the same thing for C5. And in case you're wondering why I didn't do this in part 3 of the video series, is by the time we get to the dealer's hand, we don't need to remove it anymore because there's nothing left to happen. Okay, so let me think for a second. Okay, so at this point, we know the player's whole cards and all 5 community cards. So we're ready to score the hand. So let's create another variable. We'll call it player index. And we're going to pass to the convert function, which I explain in part 2 of this series, the 7 cards that we know. So we know P1, P2, C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. 7 cards. And you may recall that, so these cards could be in any order, but you may recall that convert calls a sort function to sort them out in lowest to highest order. And now let's create another variable, and we'll call that player score. Whoops. So player score is going to be, we're going to look up in the score 7 array and the position in that of our variable, player index. So that will give us the score of that hand. Now we are ready to call the dealer function. So let's create a double variable called EV for the expected value. That will give us the expected value if the player makes the small raise. So we're going to pass to that C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5, and P1 and P2, the player's whole cards, and the player's score, and we need that array called dealer event of all the things that could, all the ways the hand could play out once it's the dealer's turn. So let's declare that, and I believe that was a size 23, and a semicolon. And did I not declare player score? Why is it underlining that? Okay, I forgot to declare. No, I did declare those. Okay, I see my mistake. We do not need to pass P1 and P2 to the dealer function because we're already passing it the player's score. That's what it mainly needs to know, not the particular cards, because we already took those out of the deck and calculated the score. It doesn't need that information. So we're going to get back an expected value. So if that expected value is greater than negative 2.0, then the player should make the small raise. So we're going to add to check event all the possible values that come back from the dealer array. Excuse me, dealer. It's called dealer event. But what if the expected value is less than negative 2? That means that the player should fold because his cards are so bad it's better to lose 2 units than more than 2 units. And that corresponds to element number 23 in our check event array. And we're going to add to that 990 because there are 990 ways you can choose 2 cards out of the 45 left in the deck by the time it gets to the dealer's turn. And let's also add all these same events in the raise event array. And later, we will evaluate which way has the higher expected value over all the ways that C4 and C5 could fall. Okay, so now let's write some code after the looping through of the turn in the river. So as I mentioned before, there's 24 possible ways this hand, the way things could happen. And it's actually 23 for checking and, 24 for checking and 23 for raising. But we put this dummy 0 at the end of raising just so we can keep the size of the arrays the same. So let's create a couple more variables. Let's let's create one for the check expected value and another one for the raise expected value. And let's initialize those to 0. So let's add to the check expected value the value that we have in the check win array, the check event array, and let's convert that to a double, times the check win, which you remember we declared up here. And this was a mistake. I didn't need to put that check EV is not an array. So now let's do the same thing, but for calculating the raise expected value. So that's going to be the raise event times the raise win. So by the time we exit this loop, we should know the expected value of checking and raising. So if the raise expected value is greater than checking, let's pass back a value of 1 to represent raising. Otherwise, we'll pass back as 0. And I'm not even sure what I'm going to do with those zeros and ones yet, but I declared it as an integer, so let's pass back something. And either way, we're going to pass back these arrays called check event and raise event, all the ways that things could happen according to whether the player checks or raises after the flop. So that is our turn function. Let's declare that. And now we're ready to analyze the flop. So our next function will cycle through all the ways that the cards could come out on the flop. So we'll call that next video part 5, so I will see you over in part 5. Thanks for watching, YouTube. Bye. Sorry, I'm back to correct a mistake I found off camera, and here it is. So here we're cycling through the 5th card, the 5th community card, and I made a lazy copy and paste error. This line here, once we have our 5th card, I am taking the 4th card out of the deck, which we already did. So I need to change this C4 to a C5, and then we need to put it back in down here. So sorry about that, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.